The date was June 6th, 1944. The time was 1:20 hours. For a Bergerfreiter Franz Hagemann of the German 91st Air Landing Division, the night air over the Cotentin Peninsula was unnervingly alive. Stationed in a damp concrete bunker sunk into a Normandy hedgerow, he had grown accustomed to the rhythms of the French countryside under occupation. There was the distant lowing of cattle, the chirping of insects, and the gentle rustle of leaves in the ancient bocage. But tonight, another sound had crept in, a low, guttural drone that seemed to vibrate in his teeth. At first it was dismissed, a lone reconnaissance plane perhaps, or a flight of night bombers passing far to the south. But the sound didn't fade. It grew. It multiplied, swelling from a hum into a deep, chest-rattling roar that seemed to be coming not from one direction but from everywhere at once. It was the sound of the sky itself being torn open. Franz exchanged a nervous glance with the other two men in his position. They were veterans of the Eastern Front, men who had seen and heard things that would break lesser soldiers. But this was different. This wasn't the shriek of Stukas or the rumble of a panzer column. This was something vast, industrial, and utterly alien. Then the sky began to burn. The 88mm flak cannons positioned miles away near Cherbourg opened up, their angry red tracers clawing at the low-hanging clouds, briefly illuminating the impossible. Against the strobing flashes of light, the underbellies of hundreds, no, thousands of C-47 transport planes were visible, a sky-choking armada flying impossibly low and fast. The air raid sirens began their mournful wail, a sound of panic that was immediately drowned out by the thunder of the engines overhead. Franz and his comrades were stunned. This wasn't a bombing run. The planes were too low, their formation too dense. Suddenly, the sky began to rain, dark shapes. Not bombs, not debris. They were men, thousands of them, spilling from the bellies of the planes like seeds thrown to the wind, their parachutes blossoming in the flak-riddled darkness. They were everywhere. Some were hit in the air, their chutes collapsing into streamers as they fell silently to the earth. Others drifted into the trees, into the flooded fields deliberately prepared by Rommel's orders, and directly onto the German positions. One landed not 50 meters from Franz's bunker with a heavy, sickening thud. Before the German soldiers could even process what they were seeing, the night erupted in a cacophony of small arms, fire, explosions, and the distinct metallic ping of a weapon they had never heard before. The invasion had begun, not from the sea as they had been endlessly drilled to expect, but from the heavens. And the men descending upon them were nothing like what they had been told. They couldn't believe it. This wasn't supposed to happen. The German soldier in 1944 was a product of one of the most effective and insidious propaganda systems ever devised. For years, he had been fed a steady diet of national superiority, racial purity, and martial invincibility. He was told he was a member of a master race, a warrior caste destined to rule. And his enemies? They were depicted as subhuman, weak, and decadent. The Soviets were portrayed as a brutish, Slavic horde, dangerous in their numbers but ultimately crude and soulless. The British were an aging empire in decline, led by cigar-chomping plutocrats. But the Americans, they were a special case. Reich Minister of Propaganda Joseph Goebbels had painted a very specific picture of the American male. He was a gangster, a product of a mongrelized society, obsessed with jazz music, Hollywood films, and material wealth. He was soft, undisciplined, and lacked the iron will that had been forged in the German people through struggle and sacrifice. German newsreels and posters showed American prisoners of war looking bewildered and boyish, their faces lacking the chiseled, hard-bitten look of the Wehrmacht veteran. They laughed at the idea that these cowboys and shopkeepers could stand against soldiers who had survived the frozen hell of Stalingrad or the cauldron of Kursk. German intelligence reports reinforced this prejudice. They acknowledged America's industrial might, the so-called brute force of its production lines that could churn out tanks and planes at an astonishing rate. But this, the propaganda insisted, was a sign of weakness, not strength. America had to rely on overwhelming material because its individual soldiers were inferior. They needed 10 tanks to do the job of one German Panther. They needed a colossal artillery barrage before they would even dare to advance. The American soldier, they were told, would not fight without a hot meal, a Coca-Cola, and an overnight pass. He fought for money and comfort, not for blood and soil, not for a sacred ideology. To the German Lanzer, who had marched for weeks on black bread and thin soup, who had fought with bayonets in the rubble of bombed-out cities, this American soldier was a contemptible figure. They never knew the truth, and they were utterly unprepared for the reality that was now crashing down into the fields and villages all around them. The men who dropped from the sky that night were not the soft, materialistic caricatures from their newsreels. They were something else entirely, something new, something terrifying. The creature that the Germans encountered in the pre-dawn chaos of June 6th was the American paratrooper, the physical embodiment of an unspoken national policy. While Germany had pioneered the use of airborne forces in their early blitzkrieg victories, America had taken the concept and perfected it with its unique industrial and cultural stamp. The paratrooper was the result of a simple, brutal philosophy. Find the toughest, most aggressive, and most resilient young men the nation has to offer, and then make them even harder. They were all volunteers, men who actively chose the most dangerous job in the army. The screening process was designed to weed out all but the most physically and psychologically robust. They were run until they collapsed, pushed out of high towers to conquer their fear of heights, and drilled relentlessly in the use of every conceivable weapon. Unlike the German army, which was based on a rigid top-down command structure, the American paratrooper was trained for chaos. He was expected to operate independently, to make his own decisions, to be a leader, a rifleman, and a saboteur all at once. The doctrine was simple. Land behind enemy lines, surrounded and cut off, and create as much havoc as possible. This mission profile didn't just require training. It required a specific mindset, a kind of controlled ferocity that the German command simply did not believe the soft Americans possessed. And then there was the equipment. The American paratrooper was a walking arsenal, a testament to the industrial power that the Germans had so foolishly underestimated. Each man jumped loaded with so much gear that he had to be helped onto the plane. His main weapon was often the M1 Garand, a semi-automatic rifle that could pour out 8 rounds of devastating 30-0. 6 ammunition in the time it took a German soldier to work the bolt on his Kar-9 8K rifle. The sound of that M1, with its distinctive final ping as the clip ejected, would become a source of dread for the Wehrmacht. In addition to his rifle, he carried a .45 caliber pistol, a trench knife, and a startling quantity of explosives. His pockets and pouches were stuffed with grenades, blocks of TNT, and detonators. His uniform itself, the M42 jumpsuit, was a source of both wonder and fear. Its baggy trousers, reinforced at the knees and featuring enormous cargo pockets, were unlike anything the Germans had ever seen. They were practical, allowing for freedom of movement and the ability to carry an immense amount of ammunition and rations. But to the German soldiers encountering them for the first time, these men in their strange baggy pants seemed almost demonic. They appeared suddenly out of the darkness, moving with incredible speed and unleashing a volume of fire that was simply shocking. They were not the clean-cut boys from the posters. They were grim-faced, armed to the teeth, and they fought with a savage intensity the Germans hadn't seen since the darkest days on the Eastern Front. They were, as one captured German officer would later call them in a report to his superiors, devils in baggy pants. And in the bloody fields of Normandy, these devils had just begun their work. In the tangled labyrinth of Norman hedgerows a few kilometers inland from Utah Beach, Lieutenant Jürgen Schmidt of the 1058th Grenadier Regiment felt a sense of bored superiority. His platoon was well dug in, commanding a vital crossroads near the village of Saint-Mère-Église. They were veterans, hardened by the brutal campaigns in Russia, and they looked upon the coming invasion with a professional cynicism. They had heard the colossal drone of the planes and seen the sky peppered with parachutes, but the initial reports filtering through their field telephones were chaotic and contradictory. Small pockets of enemy troops, scattered and disorganized. It sounded like a messy, ill-conceived raid, precisely the kind of amateurish blunder they expected from the Americans. Schmidt had shared a coarse laugh with his sergeant. "They have dropped their little gangsters all over the countryside," he had said, taking a drag from a French cigarette. "We will spend the morning hunting them like rabbits." The prevailing assumption was that these isolated paratroopers, separated from their units and lacking heavy weapons, would be easy prey once the sun came up. They were a nuisance, a diversion intended to sow confusion before the main event on the beaches. The real fight was yet to come. Around 4:30 hours, a runner stumbled into his command post, breathless and pale. He spoke of a ferocious firefight near a small stone bridge over the Murderette River at a place called La Fière. The garrison there was being overwhelmed. Schmidt was dismissive. Overwhelmed by whom? A handful of lost paratroopers? Impossible. He suspected panicked rear echelon troops were exaggerating the threat. Still, orders were orders. He was to take his platoon and reinforce the bridge, to sweep away the American pests. As his men moved out, clinking and shuffling through the damp pre-dawn darkness, their mood was one of grim confidence. They were moving into what they believed was a simple mopping-up operation. They walked in disciplined columns along the sunken lanes, their hobnailed boots crunching on the gravel. They could hear the distant, sporadic crack of rifle fire, but it sounded thin and unimpressive. It was nothing compared to the continuous, rolling thunder of an artillery duel on the Eastern Front. Schmidt allowed himself a small, contemptuous smile. The Americans were about to receive their first lesson in how real soldiers conducted war. He couldn't have been more wrong. The shock, when it came, was not a single event but a sudden, total sensory overload. As Schmidt's lead squad approached the causeway leading to the bridge, the night didn't just erupt, it detonated. From the ditches, from the trees, from the darkened windows of a farmhouse they had assumed was empty. A wall of fire of an intensity they had never conceived of slammed into them. It wasn't the measured, disciplined fire of bolt-action rifles they were used to. It was a hellish, continuous storm of lead. Schmidt was stunned by the sound. He heard the deep, hammering roar of at least 2 Browning machine guns, but it was the infantry weapons that truly defied belief. Instead of the single crack of a Mauser, followed by a pause as the soldier worked the bolt, there was a relentless semi-automatic torrent. Bang, 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 bang. A terrifying, unbroken rhythm of death that ended with a loud, metallic ping as a clip was ejected, immediately followed by the resumption of the same deafening fusillade. His men were being scythed down before they could even bring their own weapons to bear. They were trained to fire, take cover, reload, and fire again. The Americans seemed to be firing constantly, from everywhere at once. Schmidt dove into a ditch as tracer rounds zipped inches above his head, with a sound like tearing fabric. He risked a glance over the edge and saw the muzzle flashes. They were impossibly numerous, flickering like malevolent fireflies all along the opposite bank. His men who were still alive were pinned, unable to move or effectively return fire. For every shot they sent across the river, 10 seemed to come back in reply. Men were screaming, hit not once, but 2, 3, 4 times. The volume of fire was so great it was shredding the leaves from the trees and chipping stone from the ancient bridge. This was not a fight, it was an execution. They laughed at this enemy until this moment. Now, there was only terror. The American soldiers, mere shadows in their baggy pants, moved with a fluid, terrifying aggression. They weren't holding a static line, they were attacking. Grenades arced through the air, landing among his compressed squads with devastating effect. The Americans were advancing through this storm of their own making, shouting to each other in a language that sounded harsh and alien. Schmidt couldn't believe what he was seeing. These were not the soft, scared shopkeepers from the propaganda films. They were hunters, they were wolves, and his platoon had walked straight into their jaws. The firefight ended as abruptly as it had begun. The Americans, having repulsed the counterattack and secured the bridgehead, simply melted back into their positions, their fire tapering off to occasional, probing shots. For Lieutenant Schmidt and the handful of his men who could still function, a stunned, ringing silence descended, broken only by the groans of the wounded. The air was thick with the smell of cordite and blood. He crawled over to his sergeant, a hardened veteran of Kharkov, and found him propped against the muddy bank, his face a mask of disbelief. "Lieutenant," the sergeant whispered, his voice trembling, What was that? What are they? Schmidt had no answer. In less than 10 minutes, his platoon had ceased to exist. More than half his men were dead or grievously wounded. The rest were scattered and demoralized. He looked at the bodies of his soldiers, men he had led through hell and back, and saw the terrible evidence of the Americans' firepower. They were riddled with holes. The ground around them was littered with the small brass rectangles of the M1 Garand clips. He picked one up. It felt heavy, substantial, a symbol of the industrial might that had just been unleashed upon him. His entire worldview, his belief in German martial superiority, had been shattered. The propaganda was a lie. Everything he had been told was a lie. They were not facing frightened boys fighting for Coca-Cola. They were facing an enemy whose ferocity and firepower were beyond anything they had ever prepared for. As the grey light of dawn began to filter through the trees, illuminating the carnage, Jürgen Schmidt knew with a chilling certainty that the war had changed, and that survival, let alone victory, was now a terrifyingly distant prospect. The initial, frantic reports from men like Lieutenant Schmidt were at first dismissed by the German command staff at Saint-Lô and Caen as battlefield hysteria. It was the predictable panic of second-rate garrison troops encountering their first real taste of combat. The senior officers, men of the Prussian military tradition, looked at their maps, at the neat lines and symbols representing divisions and regiments, and they couldn't believe the scattered reports. War was a science of fronts, of flanks, of organized, linear assault and defense. The idea of thousands of enemy soldiers operating independently deep within their rear areas was not just tactically inconvenient, it was an affront to the very logic of warfare. The official assessment was that the American airborne drop was a failure, a panicked, scattered mess of isolated soldiers who would be systematically hunted down and eliminated within 48 hours. But as the sun rose on June 7th and then June 8th, a new and terrifying picture began to emerge. The shock was not a one-time event. It was becoming a system. The calls for help were not subsiding. They were increasing, and they were coming from all directions. A vital bridge was blown. A key crossroads was ambushed. An artillery battery was silenced by a sudden, savage attack out of the darkness. What the German command had mistaken for chaos was, in fact, a new and brutally effective doctrine of war. The American paratroopers weren't lost. They were regrouping. They weren't isolated. They were forming ad hoc units and attacking with an initiative that was simply stunning to the rigid, top-down German military mind. This wasn't a blunder. It was a strategy. The initial shock of that first encounter was rapidly hardening into the new reality of the Normandy campaign. The enemy was behind them, beside them, and in front of them, all at once. One of the most brutal lessons in this new reality was taught to the elite German 6th Fallschirmjäger Regiment, the Green Devils, in the shattered town of Carentan. These were no garrison troops. They were Germany's own elite paratroopers, hardened veterans of Crete and the Eastern Front. They viewed themselves as the pinnacle of the warrior ideal and were deeply contemptuous of their supposed American counterparts. When they were ordered to hold Carentan, a critical town linking the Utah and Omaha beachheads, they did so with an arrogant confidence. They fortified the town's stone buildings, set up interlocking fields of fire with their MG-42 machine guns, and waited for the American gangsters to attack. They expected a conventional frontal assault they could slaughter with ease. What they got instead was a vision of hell. The American 101st Airborne didn't just attack Carentan, they swarmed it from every conceivable direction. The Germans were stunned by the sheer, unrelenting ferocity of the assault. The Americans advanced under their own massive barrages of mortar fire, which they seemed to possess in limitless quantities. They used bazookas not as anti-tank weapons, but as mobile artillery to blow holes in the thick stone walls of the houses the Germans were defending. And everywhere there was the sound of the M1 Garand, a German Fallschirmjäger, huddled in a second-story window with his Kar 9 8K rifle, could fire one carefully aimed shot before having to work his bolt. In that same span of time, an American paratrooper in the street below could unleash an entire 8-round clip, stitching the window frame, the wall, and anything behind it, with a blistering fusillade of 30 caliber rounds. The German soldiers were shocked. They were pinned down, unable to even peek out of their positions without drawing an overwhelming volume of fire. The Americans in their baggy pants moved with a reckless, terrifying momentum, charging across open streets and clearing houses with grenades and submachine guns. To the German veterans who practiced a more methodical, cautious style of urban warfare, this was madness. But it was a madness that worked. The American paratroopers were willing to take casualties to maintain pressure, to keep the enemy reeling and unable to organize a coherent defense. For the proud German Green Devils, the Battle for Carentan was a psychological unraveling. They were supposed to be the elite, but they found themselves outfought, outmaneuvered, and, most galling of all, completely overwhelmed by the firepower of an enemy they had never known. They had been told they were fighting a soft, decadent opponent. Instead, they were fighting a relentless force that seemed to embody America's industrial might in the hands of every single soldier. This pattern repeated itself with nightmarish frequency in the claustrophobic hell of the Normandy hedgerows. The Bocage country was a defender's dream, a three-dimensional chessboard of sunken lanes, thick earthworks, and small fields that could each be turned into a separate fortress. A single German machine gun team, well sighted in a corner hedgerow, could hold up an entire company. For the German infantrymen, the strategy was simple. Wait in ambush, let the Americans enter the kill zone, and annihilate them. But the American paratroopers refused to play by these rules. They were innovators of violence. A German squad, waiting in silent anticipation for the Americans to come down the lane, would suddenly be shattered by an attack from the flank. The paratroopers had simply used their TNT to blow a hole straight through the base of the hedgerow, creating their own door into the ambush site. Other times, they would appear as if from nowhere, crawling over the top of the 10-foot-high hedgerows, spraying fire down into the German positions before the defenders could even reorient their weapons. German soldiers who survived these encounters spoke of them with a kind of awe. They never knew where the next attack would come from. The Americans seemed to be everywhere, their baggy pants allowing them to move through the thick undergrowth with a silent athleticism that was deeply unsettling. And through it all, one sound came to symbolize this new, terrifying American power. It wasn't the roar of a tank or the scream of a dive bomber. It was a small metallic sound, the distinctive ping of an M1 Garand's N-block clip being ejected. For the German Lanzer, this sound became a Pavlovian trigger for absolute dread. In his own army, the brief silence after a volley of shots meant his enemy was vulnerable, fumbling with a stripper clip or working a bolt handle. It was a moment to counterattack, to move. But the American ping meant the opposite. It was not a signal of respite. It was the sound of imminent doom. It meant an American soldier had just fired 8 rounds with incredible speed and accuracy. And that sound, which echoed for a fraction of a second across the battlefield, was instantly followed by the slam of a new full clip being loaded. The silence was not an opportunity. It was a deadly pause, the drawing of a breath before the storm began anew. German veterans taught new replacements to listen for the ping and to charge the American position in that fleeting moment of vulnerability. It was a fatal miscalculation. The Americans worked in teams. One man's ping was covered by the continuous fire of his squad mates. More often than not, the German soldier who charged at the sound of the ping was met with a fresh volley of 8 rounds. The sound became a psychological weapon, a constant reminder that the enemy was better armed, faster to reload, and could generate a volume of fire that was simply, horrifyingly, impossible to match. It was the sound of American industry, the sound of their own impending death, delivered 8 rounds at a time. By the second week of the invasion, the reports flowing back to the headquarters of the German 7th Army were no longer just panicked field dispatches. They were a consistent, terrifying chorus. The tone of the professional staff officers, men who prided themselves on sober, detached analysis, began to change. Disbelief gave way to grudging respect, which quickly curdled into outright alarm. Maps that had once been neat and orderly were now peppered with red circles and grease pencil arrows in places they shouldn't be deep within the German rear. The term Teufel in Weitenhosen, devils in baggy pants, which had begun as a frightened exclamation from a captured Obergefreiter, was now appearing in official situation reports. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, a master of bold, decisive maneuver, found himself hamstrung by an enemy that refused to conform to any known tactical doctrine. His panzer divisions, the armoured fist he intended to use to smash the invasion on the beaches, were being bled white before they even reached the coast. They were ambushed at village crossroads, their supply columns were savaged on tree-lined country roads, and their command posts were raided in the dead of night by grim-faced men who appeared from the darkness and vanished just as quickly. The German High Command was stunned. They had a word for this type of warfare. Bandenkrieg, the fight against partisans or bandits. It was something they had dealt with in the vast forests of Russia or the mountains of Yugoslavia. To see it being practiced with such devastating professionalism by the regular army of a major world power was a shock to their entire military philosophy. They realized with a dawning horror that the American airborne assault was not a failure. It was a new, insidious form of strategic strangulation. The paratroopers were a cancer, metastasizing within their defensive lines, paralyzing their ability to react. Precious elite units, like the formidable 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division, Götz von Berlichingen, were diverted from their critical mission of counterattacking the beachheads and were instead thrown into the grinding, thankless task of trying to clear the bow cage. The German command structure, so effective in a conventional war of fronts and formations, was completely unsuited to this new, three-dimensional battlefield. They were a hammer trying to swat a swarm of hornets. In response to this unprecedented threat, a series of desperate countermeasures were hastily conceived and implemented. Special units, dubbed Jagdkommandos or hunting commandos, were formed from experienced veterans and given a single mission: hunt the paratroopers. These units were supposed to be the answer, men who could match the Americans in cunning and fieldcraft. They were trained to move silently, to set clever ambushes, and to track the Americans through the dense Norman countryside. But the entire concept was flawed from the start. The Germans were still thinking in terms of conventional warfare. Their Jagdkommandos moved with methodical precision, but they were tied to the roads and well-worn paths. The American paratroopers, by contrast, treated the entire landscape as a highway. They moved through the thickest parts of the hedgerows, waded through swamps, and used the terrain in ways the Germans couldn't believe. The hunters became the hunted. A German patrol, moving with what they thought was extreme stealth down a sunken lane, would suddenly be annihilated by fire from their flanks and even from behind them. The Americans had simply let them walk into the trap, their positions perfectly concealed in the dense foliage the Germans were so reluctant to enter. Another futile measure was a propaganda campaign directed at their own troops. The High Command began circulating stories that the American paratroopers were not soldiers at all, but convicts and psychopathic criminals released from America's prisons and promised pardons in exchange for fighting. This was meant to dehumanize the enemy, to paint them as dishonorable thugs who could be beaten by racially pure Aryan warriors. The strategy backfired catastrophically. The German soldiers saw the savage, relentless way the paratroopers fought, their willingness to engage in brutal close-quarters combat with knives and trench shovels, their terrifying proficiency with explosives, their sheer aggression, and the propaganda seemed to ring true. They weren't fighting soldiers, they were fighting monsters. This didn't steel their resolve, it shattered their morale. The fear was amplified tenfold. Every shadow in the bowcage now held the potential for a slavering madman. A devil in baggy pants, who fought without rules and killed without hesitation. The attempt to demonize the enemy only succeeded in turning them into a legendary, unstoppable bogeyman. The German command simply could not comprehend that a democratic, decadent nation could produce soldiers who were not only their equals in toughness, but were, in this specific environment, their superiors. For the average German soldier like Grenadier Klaus Richter, a 19-year-old replacement rushed to the Normandy front in mid-June. The psychological impact was devastating. He arrived full of the confidence instilled by years of propaganda, eager to win his Iron Cross. He was assigned to a platoon where the veterans, hollow-eyed and gaunt, spoke in hushed tones about the Springers. They warned him never to make noise at night never to light a cigarette, and never, ever, to assume a hedgerow was just a hedgerow. Klaus thought they were cowards. He laughed at their stories until his first night patrol, sent to investigate a suspected American observation post. His squad of 10 men moved nervously through the darkness. The silence was absolute, unnatural. Suddenly, from less than 20 feet away, a voice called out in perfect, taunting German, "Hey Fritz, where are you going?" Before anyone could react, the entire world exploded in a blinding storm of tracer fire. The sound was not the familiar, spaced rhythm of German weapons. It was the semi-automatic roar of the Garands, a continuous, deafening torrent of fire that cut through the night. Klaus dove to the ground, his heart hammering against his ribs. The firefight lasted maybe 30 seconds. When it was over, he was one of only 3 survivors. The Americans were gone, melted back into the night. They left behind 7 dead Germans, and the chilling echo of that single terrifying sound, the ping of an empty clip. From that moment on, Klaus understood. He understood the fear in the veteran's eyes. The war for him was no longer about victory or glory. It was about surviving the next patrol, about praying he would not hear that sound, would not see those baggy pants emerging from the shadows. The belief in German superiority, the central pillar of his entire existence, had been shot to pieces in 30 seconds. All that was left was the gnawing, paralyzing fear of the devil who owned the dark. The terror, inspired by the American paratroopers in the hedgerows of Normandy, was not an isolated phenomenon. It was a microcosm of a much larger, strategic truth that the German High Command was being forced to confront across the entire front. The devil in baggy pants was more than just a ferocious individual soldier. He was the final, undeniable product of the American system they had so arrogantly dismissed. The German war machine was built on a philosophy of a warrior elite, the Übermensch, a racially pure Superman whose innate superiority would triumph. This ideology produced magnificent tanks like the Tiger and highly disciplined soldiers, but the system itself was brittle and wasteful. It could not mass-produce its elite weapons, nor could it mass-produce its elite soldiers. America, in stark contrast, had approached war with the same ruthless democratic efficiency it applied to building automobiles. It had created a system to mass-produce excellence. The paratrooper was not a Superman born of a master race. He was a testament to a nation that could take a farmer from Iowa, a steel worker from Pittsburgh, or a clerk from New York, and through superior training, superior doctrine, and an avalanche of superior equipment, turn him into one of the most effective soldiers on the planet. The M1 Garand, the weapon whose sound had become synonymous with fear, was the perfect symbol of this. Germany, with all its engineering prowess, still equipped the majority of its soldiers with a bolt-action rifle conceptually unchanged from the 19th century. America had designed, perfected, and issued a rugged, reliable semi-automatic rifle as its standard infantry weapon, an industrial and logistical feat the Germans couldn't believe was possible. Every paratrooper carried the firepower of a German rifle squad in his own 2 hands. He was backed by a Niagara of supplies, limitless ammunition, K-rations, medical kits with sulfur powder and morphine syrettes, and an endless supply of explosives. The Germans, who were already beginning to feel the pinch of their overstretched supply lines, were shocked by the sheer material wealth the Americans were willing to expend on a single soldier. This wasn't a war of spirit against spirit, as their propaganda claimed. It was a war of a pre-industrial military philosophy against a fully industrialized military superpower. The paratrooper was simply the cutting edge of an industrial tidal wave that was about to break and sweep the Wehrmacht away. The ultimate demonstration of this crushing industrial and moral dominance came in late July 1944. The brutal, grinding fight in the Bocage had reached a stalemate, but this was a stalemate America had no intention of accepting. On July 25th, the German defenders of the Panzer Division, dug in near Saint-Lô, looked up to see a sight that signaled the end of their world. The sky turned black with bombers. Not dozens, not hundreds, but more than 3,000 American and British heavy and medium bombers appeared, flying in majestic, terrifying waves. In an operation code named Cobra, they proceeded to systematically erase a 6,000-meter-wide corridor of the German front line from the face of the earth. For the German soldiers on the ground, it was an apocalypse. The earth bucked and heaved as thousands upon thousands of bombs rained down, vaporizing bunkers, tossing tanks into the air like toys, and burying entire companies alive. Men who survived were left deafened, concussed, and gibbering with shell shock, their minds shattered by the sheer, unimaginable scale of the destruction. It was industrial war made manifest, a force of nature that no amount of courage or fanaticism could withstand. And then, through the smoke and dust of this man-made earthquake, came the devils. The American infantry, spearheaded by the same airborne divisions that had terrified them for weeks, advanced into the cratered moonscape. But now they weren't just men in baggy pants with rifles. They were supported by swarms of Sherman tanks, newly modified with monstrous steel tusks, the rhino hedge cutters that allowed them to rip through the earthen walls of the bocage as if they were made of paper. The German defences, so impregnable just hours before, were now a shattered ruin, and the American forces poured through the gap in an unstoppable torrent. The German soldiers who had survived the bombing were now met with the relentless, overwhelming ground assault. They were stunned, broken, and utterly demoralized. The speed, the power, the sheer scale of the American breakout was something they never knew could be unleashed. The fight for Normandy was over. The race across France had begun. In the end, the German soldier in Normandy was defeated not just by bombs and bullets, but by the shattering of his most deeply held beliefs. He had been taught that he was the best, a member of a martial race destined for victory. He was confronted instead by an enemy who was his equal in courage, his superior in initiative, and his overwhelming master in the tools of war. The American paratrooper, the so-called decadent gangster, had proven to be a more adaptable and more lethal soldier in the Norman hedgerows than the product of a decade of militaristic indoctrination. The devil in baggy pants became a legend in the Wehrmacht, not because he was a demon, but because he was something far more terrifying. He was proof that their entire worldview was a lie. He was the living embodiment of a nation that they had laughed at, a nation that had now come to obliterate them with a power they couldn't comprehend, delivered one 8-round clip at a time.